60 seconds to the cage. The crowd is roaring, thousands of people screaming. But he doesn't hear them. His coach is talking, giving last-minute instructions. But he's not listening. Not really. He's somewhere else. Somewhere quiet. His opponent is across the cage, staring, trying to intimidate, trying to project dominance. Most people in this situation would feel their stomach drop. Their hands would shake. Their heart would pound so hard they'd think it might explode. Fear would flood their system, the primal, undeniable fear of imminent violence. But look at this fighter's face. It's calm, not tense, not nervous, calm. His breathing is steady. His eyes are focused but not wide. His body language is relaxed, almost loose. And if you could measure his internal state, you'd find something remarkable. He's not afraid. Not because he's blocking out the fear, not because he's pretending to be brave, but because genuinely, in this moment, fear is absent. What he feels instead is something else entirely. Anticipation, focus, a kind of heightened clarity. Some fighters even describe it as peace. How is this possible? How does someone stand on the edge of a fistfight, knowing they're about to be hit in the face repeatedly, knowing they might get knocked unconscious in front of millions of people, knowing pain is seconds away, and not feel fear? The answer isn't what most people think. It's not that these fighters are fearless. Most of them will tell you they feel fear in other contexts. Fear of failure, fear of letting people down, fear of injury that ends their career. But in the moment before combat, the fear that should be overwhelming is just gone. This isn't bravado. This isn't machismo. This is a specific psychological state that some people have learned to access. And it's one of the most misunderstood aspects of combat sports and warfare. Most people assume fighters are just built different, that they have some genetic mutation that makes them immune to fear, that they're wired for violence in a way normal people aren't. But that's not true. Many elite fighters will tell you they were terrified the first time they fought. Absolutely terrified. But somewhere along the way, something changed. They didn't learn to ignore fear. They learned to transform it. They learned that the same physiological state that most people interpret as terror can be interpreted as excitement. That the racing heart, the adrenaline, the heightened senses, those aren't necessarily fear signals. They're arousal signals. And arousal can be reframed. There's a concept in psychology called arousal reappraisal. It's the idea that emotions aren't fixed. They're interpretations of physiological states. Your heart is pounding. Your hands are sweaty. Your breathing is rapid. Your brain asks, what does this mean? And depending on the context and your training, your brain might answer, this means I'm in danger, fear. Or it might answer, this means I'm ready, excitement. Fighters who don't feel fear have trained their brains to default to the second interpretation. The physical sensation is the same, the meaning is different, and that difference changes everything. But there's more to it than just reinterpretation. There's also exposure. The first time you're in a fight, your nervous system treats it as a novel, life-threatening event. Your amygdala is screaming. Your body is flooding with stress hormones. You're in survival mode. But the 10th time, the 100th time, your amygdala has updated its threat assessment. Fighting is no longer novel, it's familiar, and familiarity reduces fear. This is why experienced fighters often seem bored before fights. They've done this so many times that their brain has recategorized combat from emergency to Tuesday. There's also a deeper layer. Some fighters describe entering a state where the sense of self disappears. They're not thinking. They're not analyzing. They're not aware of being afraid or not afraid. They're just moving, reacting, existing purely in the moment. Psychologists call this flow state or sometimes dissociation. And in this state, fear doesn't exist because the you that would be afraid doesn't exist either. Then there are the fighters who seem to genuinely enjoy the violence, not in a sadistic way, but in a way that suggests they've found something in combat that they can't find anywhere else. A kind of aliveness, a clarity, a simplicity. Life outside the cage is complicated, full of uncertainty and ambiguity, but in the cage everything is clear. There's an opponent. There's a goal. And for those few minutes, nothing else matters. This can border on addiction. Some fighters struggle to feel anything in normal life because normal life lacks the intensity of combat. The fear they don't feel before fighting, they feel it everywhere else. In relationships, in social situations, in the mundane parts of life. Fighting is where they feel safe, where they feel competent, where they feel real. So this isn't a simple story of fearless warriors. It's a complex psychological landscape where fear, excitement, dissociation, addiction, and identity all intersect. And understanding it requires looking at neuroscience, at training, at individual temperament, and at the cost of living without fear. Because not feeling fear before combat might sound like a superpower, but for some it's also a curse. Let's talk about what's happening in the body and brain when a fighter steps into the ring or cage without fear. Because the physiology is identical to fear, the interpretation is what's different. When your body perceives a threat, the amygdala triggers the release of adrenaline and cortisol. Your heart rate increases, blood pressure rises, breathing quickens, pupils dilate, blood flow redirects to major muscle groups, digestion shuts down, you're in fight or flight mode. This is the same response whether you're about to fight in a cage or being chased by a predator. Your body doesn't distinguish, it just knows. High-stakes situation, prepare for action. Now here's where it gets interesting. Excitement and fear produce nearly identical physiological responses. Racing heart, sweaty palms, rapid breathing. The difference isn't in the body, it's in the brain's interpretation of what those signals mean. If your prefrontal cortex interprets the arousal as danger, you experience fear. Your thoughts become, I'm not ready. I might get hurt. I want to escape. If your prefrontal cortex interprets the same arousal as readiness, you experience excitement. Your thoughts become, I'm prepared. I'm focused. Let's go. This is why cognitive reappraisal is so powerful. It's not about suppressing fear. It's about relabeling the physiological state. My heart is racing. That means I'm afraid becomes, my heart is racing. That means my body is preparing me for peak performance. Research shows that when people are taught to reframe anxiety as excitement before a stressful task, they perform better than people who try to calm down, because trying to calm down fights against your physiology. But reframing works with it. You're acknowledging the arousal and giving it a functional meaning. Fighters who don't feel fear have internalized this reframe. They don't experience pre-fight arousal as threatening. They experience it as energizing. And that shift happens through repeated exposure. The first time you fight, your amygdala treats it as a life or death situation. But after dozens or hundreds of fights, the amygdala learns, this is intense, but we survive this. This is familiar. And familiarity reduces the fear response. This is stress inoculation. Each exposure to combat teaches your nervous system that combat is survivable. Over time, the physiological arousal remains, but the fear interpretation fades. But there's another phenomenon at play, selective attention. When you're afraid, your attention scatters. You're hyper-aware of everything. Every sound, every movement, every possible threat. This is adaptive if you're in an unpredictable environment. But in a fight, it's counterproductive. Fighters train to narrow their focus. They're not thinking about the crowd, they're not thinking about the cameras, they're not thinking about what happens if they lose. They're thinking about the opponent's lead hand, the distance, the openings. Their focus is so narrow that there's no mental space for fear. This is called attentional narrowing, and it's both trained and automatic in high-level fighters. Their brains have learned to filter out irrelevant stimuli and focus only on the tactically important. There's also the role of dopamine. Dopamine isn't just a reward chemical. It's also involved in motivation and anticipation. When a fighter is preparing for combat, their dopamine system can activate in anticipation of the challenge. This creates a state of motivated arousal rather than fearful arousal. Some fighters even experience a dopamine hit from the violence itself. The impact, the exchange, the submission. This isn't sadism. It's the brain's reward system activating in response to overcoming a challenge, and if that reward pathway is strong enough, it can override fear entirely. Then there's endorphins and endocannabinoids. During intense physical exertion, and especially during combat, the body releases these natural painkillers and mood elevators. This is sometimes called runner's high, but fighters experience it too. And when you associate fighting with a neurochemical reward, fear diminishes. But here's the critical point. Not all fighters experience this the same way. Some genuinely don't feel fear. Others feel it intensely, but have trained to act despite it. The external behavior looks the same, but the internal experience is completely different. There's also emotional blunting in some fighters. After years of combat, their emotional range can narrow. They don't feel intense fear, but they also don't feel intense joy or sadness. Everything flattens. This is a sign of chronic stress or even trauma. The nervous system has adapted to extreme arousal by dampening all emotional responses. And finally, there's dissociation. Some fighters report feeling like they're watching themselves from outside their body during a fight. They're not in the experience. They're observing it. This detachment can eliminate fear because the self that would be afraid isn't present. This can be adaptive in the moment. But if it becomes a chronic pattern, it's a trauma response. And it can create problems outside the cage because the fighter can't access emotions when they need to. So when you see a fighter who looks calm before combat, understand that multiple neurochemical and psychological processes might be at play. They might be reframing arousal as excitement. They might have habituated to combat through exposure. They might be in a flow state with narrowed attention. They might be experiencing dopamine-driven motivation. Or they might be dissociating. The point is, the absence of visible fear doesn't mean the absence of internal complexity. It just means the fighter has found a way, intentionally or not, to override the fear response. And that override comes with benefits and costs. Not all fighters who don't feel fear got there the same way. Let's explore the different psychological profiles. The natural. This fighter genuinely seems to lack a normal fear response. From their very first fight, they weren't scared. They might feel nervousness, anticipation, excitement, but not fear in the way most people experience it. Neuroscience suggests some people have lower amygdala reactivity. Their threat detection system is less sensitive. This is rare, but it exists. The advantage is obvious. They're calm under pressure from day one. The disadvantage is they might take unnecessary risks because they don't have the internal warning system that keeps most people safe. The conditioned. This fighter was terrified at first, absolutely terrified. But through repeated exposure, their nervous system adapted. The fear gradually faded. Now, after hundreds of sparring sessions, dozens of fights, countless hours of training, their brain has recategorized combat as familiar. It's not threatening anymore. It's just what they do. This is the most common type. The fear was trained out through sheer repetition. The advantage is they've earned their calm. The disadvantage is if they take a long break, the fear can return because the conditioning weakens. The reframer. This fighter feels the physiological arousal but is trained to interpret it as excitement rather than fear. They're consciously using cognitive reappraisal. Before the fight, they might say to themselves, "My heart is racing. That means I'm ready." They're not suppressing fear. They're relabeling it. This requires mental discipline and self-awareness. The advantage is it's a skill that can be applied in other high-pressure situations. The disadvantage is it requires conscious effort. If their mental game is off, the reframe can fail, and the fear can flood back. The flow warrior. This fighter enters a state of complete absorption. They're not thinking about fear or courage. They're not thinking at all. They've trained so much that the movements are automatic. When the fight starts, conscious thought disappears. They're pure reaction. Pure instinct. This is flow state, and it's one of the most sought-after psychological states in combat sports. The advantage is peak performance. Time seems to slow. Everything feels effortless. The disadvantage is you can't force flow. It comes when it comes. And if you're not in flow, you might struggle. The dissociator. This fighter doesn't feel fear because they've psychologically detached from the experience. They're watching themselves fight from a distance. This often develops as a trauma response, either from combat itself or from earlier life experiences. Dissociation protects the psyche from overwhelming threat by creating distance. The advantage is they can endure extreme violence without psychological breakdown. The disadvantage is this is a fragile coping mechanism. Outside the cage, they might struggle with emotional connection, presence, and mental health. The adrenaline addict. This fighter doesn't fear combat because combat is where they feel most alive. Normal life feels flat, boring, meaningless. But in the cage, everything is vivid, clear, real. They're not avoiding fear. They're seeking the intensity that comes with it. This can border on pathological. They might take fights they shouldn't take, push their bodies beyond safe limits, or struggle to function in civilian life. The advantage is they're highly motivated. The disadvantage is they're driven by a need that can't be sustainably satisfied. Eventually, the body breaks down, or the psychological dependence becomes destructive. The Stoic warrior. This fighter has a philosophical relationship with fear. They've trained in martial traditions that emphasize mental discipline, acceptance of death, and detachment from outcome. They might practice meditation, study warrior codes like Bushido, or follow Stoic philosophy. They don't lack fear. They've made peace with it. They've accepted that they might get hurt, might lose, might even die. And that acceptance removes fear's power. The advantage is deep psychological resilience. The disadvantage is this level of acceptance can create emotional distance in other areas of life. Here's what's critical to understand. The absence of fear doesn't always mean health. Sometimes it's a sign of adaptation. Sometimes it's a sign of trauma. Sometimes it's a cultivated skill. And sometimes it's pathology. A fighter who doesn't feel fear because they've habituated through training is different from a fighter who doesn't feel fear because they've dissociated from their body. One is functional, the other is a red flag. And the fighters themselves often don't know which category they're in. They just know they don't feel afraid anymore. And for some, that's a relief. For others, it's concerning because they've lost touch with a fundamental human emotion that serves an important protective function. Fear exists for a reason. It keeps us safe. It makes us cautious. It forces us to prepare. A complete absence of fear can be as dangerous as too much of it. The goal isn't fearlessness, it's fear competence. The ability to feel fear and still function. The ability to use fear as information without being controlled by it. The healthiest fighters aren't the ones who never feel fear. They're the ones who feel it, acknowledge it, and choose how to respond. Let's talk about what happens when fighters enter a state where fear is impossible because the self that would be afraid temporarily ceases to exist. Flow state is a term coined by psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. It's a state of complete absorption in an activity. Time distorts. Self-consciousness disappears. Action and awareness merge. You're not thinking about what you're doing. You're just doing it. And it feels effortless. Elite fighters describe this state frequently. I don't remember the fight. It felt like I was watching myself from outside. Everything slowed down. I just reacted. I wasn't thinking. These are all descriptions of flow. In flow, the default mode network in the brain, which is responsible for self-referential thinking, deactivates. The part of your brain that narrates your experience, that worries about how you're perceived, that generates anxiety, it goes offline. What remains is pure sensory processing and motor execution. This is why fighters in flow don't feel fear. Fear requires a self to be afraid. And in flow, the self is absent. There's no I to be threatened. There's just movement, reaction, presence. But flow is fickle. You can't force it. It emerges when several conditions are met: clear goals, immediate feedback, challenge skill balance, and complete focus. Fighting provides all of these. The goal is clear, win. The feedback is immediate, you get hit or you don't. The challenge matches skill, ideally, and the intensity forces focus. But not every fight produces flow. Sometimes fighters are too amped up. Sometimes they're overthinking. Sometimes they're injured or distracted. And when flow doesn't come, they have to rely on grit, technique, and mental discipline. Dissociation looks similar to flow but comes from a different place. Dissociation is a trauma response. It's the mind's way of protecting itself from overwhelming experience by creating psychological distance. A fighter who dissociates might describe the fight as feeling unreal or like a dream. They might not remember pain. They might feel like they're watching themselves from above. This isn't flow. This is the brain saying, "This is too much. I'm checking out." The difference matters. Flow is optimal functioning. Dissociation is protective shutdown. Flow enhances performance. Dissociation allows you to endure, but often at a cost. Fighters who regularly dissociate are at risk for depersonalization and derealization outside of combat. They might feel disconnected from their bodies, from their emotions, from reality itself. This is a sign of unprocessed trauma, and it needs therapeutic intervention. But in the moment, both flow and dissociation can produce the same external result: a fighter who doesn't seem afraid and performs at a high level. The internal experience, though, is vastly different. Then there's the void. Some fighters describe entering a state of complete emptiness before combat. No thoughts, no emotions, no fear, no excitement, just nothing. A calm, silent void, and from that void, they move. This is often the result of meditative training. Fighters who practice mindfulness, Zen meditation, or other contemplative traditions learn to access this state. It's not dissociation. It's presence without content, awareness without narrative. In this state, fear can't arise because fear is a story. It's a thought about the future. I might get hurt. I might lose. But in the void, there's no future. There's only now. And in now, there's just what is: an opponent, a cage, movement. This is incredibly difficult to achieve and even harder to maintain. Most fighters dip into it briefly, if at all, but those who can access it consistently have a profound psychological advantage. There's also the question of what happens after. Flow states and even healthy dissociation can create a kind of withdrawal. After the fight, when you return to normal consciousness, normal life can feel dull, flat, meaningless, because you've experienced a state of such intensity and clarity that ordinary existence pales in comparison. This is why some fighters struggle with retirement. It's not just losing the sport, it's losing access to a state of being that made them feel most alive. And without it, they don't know who they are. So the ability to transcend fear by transcending self is powerful, but it's also dangerous. Because if your only access to flow is through violence, what happens when you can't fight anymore? How do you find that state in other contexts? Can you? These are questions many fighters face, but few have answers to. Because combat sports don't prepare you for life after combat. They prepare you to be a weapon. And when you're no longer needed as a weapon, the transition can be psychologically devastating. Let's talk about what nobody wants to admit. Not feeling fear before combat comes with a cost. And for some fighters, that cost is enormous. Trauma. Repeated exposure to violence, even consensual violence, can create cumulative trauma. Concussions, knockouts, submissions where you're choked unconscious. These aren't just physical events, they're psychological ones. And over time, they change the brain. Some fighters develop PTSD not from a single event, but from the accumulation of hundreds of violent encounters. They have nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbness, difficulty sleeping. But they don't recognize it as trauma because it didn't come from one horrific moment. It came from a career. And because the culture of combat sports glorifies toughness, fighters often don't seek help. They think, I chose this, I can't complain. But trauma doesn't care about choice. It accumulates regardless. Adrenaline addiction is another hidden cost. Some fighters become physiologically and psychologically dependent on the adrenaline rush of combat. Normal life doesn't produce that neurochemical cocktail, so they feel flat, bored, depressed between fights. This can lead to risky behavior outside the sport, dangerous driving, extreme sports, picking fights, anything to recreate that feeling. And if they can't get it, They spiral. Some turn to substances. Some become violent in contexts where violence isn't appropriate. Some just feel dead inside until the next fight. Emotional desensibilization is common. When you spend years training to override your fear response, to compartmentalize pain, to dissociate from discomfort, those skills don't stay in the cage. They bleed into the rest of your life. Fighters often struggle with emotional intimacy. They can't access vulnerability, they can't cry. They can't connect deeply because they've trained themselves to be emotionally armored. And that armor doesn't come off just because you left the gym. Partners and family members describe feeling like they're living with someone who's emotionally unreachable. The fighter is physically present but emotionally absent. And they often don't know how to fix it because emotional openness feels dangerous. It feels weak. There's also identity collapse. Many fighters build their entire sense of self around being a warrior, around not feeling fear, around being tough. But what happens when injury forces retirement? When age slows you down? When you lose and can't bounce back? If fighting is your identity and you can't fight anymore, who are you? This existential crisis leads some fighters to depression, substance abuse, even suicide, because they've built their self-worth on something that's temporary, and when it's gone, they're lost. CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, is the physical manifestation of repeated head trauma. It causes cognitive decline, emotional instability, and personality changes. We're only beginning to understand how common it is in combat sports. But fighters who don't feel fear might also not respect the danger of accumulating head impacts. They take damage they shouldn't because pain and fear are absent. Then there's the normalization of violence. When violence is your profession, the line between appropriate and inappropriate use of force can blur. Some fighters struggle to de-escalate conflicts. They respond to disrespect or provocation with physical aggression because that's the language they've spoken for years. This can lead to legal problems, relationship destruction, and social isolation. People are afraid of them, and they don't understand why because in their world, violence is normal, controlled, part of the job. There's also the inability to feel peace. Some fighters are so accustomed to high arousal that they can't relax. They can't sit still. They can't enjoy quiet moments. Their nervous system is stuck in a chronic state of activation, and rest feels like weakness. This leads to burnout. The body breaks down, the mind fractures, but they keep pushing because stopping feels impossible. And eventually something catastrophic happens. Injury, breakdown, crisis. Not every fighter experiences these costs. Some navigate combat sports healthily. They maintain balance. They process their experiences. They know when to stop. They have support systems. They have identities outside of fighting. But many don't, and the culture doesn't support seeking help. Therapy is seen as weakness. Taking time off is seen as softness. Admitting you're struggling is seen as failure. So fighters suffer in silence. And from the outside, they look fine. They're not complaining. They're still showing up, they're still tough, but inside they're breaking. And by the time anyone notices, the damage is often irreversible. The absence of fear before combat isn't just a strength. For some, it's a warning sign. A sign that the nervous system has adapted in ways that might not be healthy long-term. And we need to start asking, at what cost does fearlessness come? And is it worth it? So how do you train the mind to handle combat without destroying yourself in the process? How do you cultivate courage without numbing yourself emotionally? Here's what works. Gradual exposure, not shock. Don't throw yourself into full combat unprepared. Start with controlled sparring, low intensity, protective gear. Build up slowly. Let your nervous system adapt incrementally. This reduces trauma accumulation and allows for healthy habituation rather than dissociation. Separate the person from the fighter. You are not your performance. Fighting is something you do, not who you are. Build an identity outside of combat. Have hobbies. Have relationships. Have purpose beyond the cage. This protects you from identity collapse when fighting ends. Practice emotional literacy. Train yourself to identify and name emotions. Fear isn't weakness, it's information. Learn to feel it, understand it, and then decide how to respond. This prevents emotional blunting and maintains your capacity for connection outside of fighting. Use cognitive reappraisal, not suppression. Don't push fear down, reframe it. I'm nervous becomes, I'm energized. This works with your physiology instead of against it, and it doesn't require emotional shutdown. Master your breath. Box breathing before fights. Deep diaphragmatic breathing during training. Your breath is the bridge between your conscious and autonomic nervous system. Control your breath, and you gain a degree of control over your fear response. Visualize success, but also adversity. Don't just imagine winning. Imagine getting hurt and recovering. Imagine getting tired and pushing through. Imagine fear arising and choosing courage. This mental rehearsal prepares you for the full spectrum of combat experience, not just the highlight reel. Build flow through skill mastery. Flow happens when challenge matches skill. If you're constantly overmatched, you'll be anxious. If you're constantly undermatched, you'll be bored. Train at the edge of your ability. That's where flow lives. Debrief every fight. Process the experience. What did you feel? What worked? What didn't? What did you learn? This prevents trauma from accumulating unprocessed. It integrates the experience instead of compartmentalizing it. Know your why. Why are you fighting? If it's just for ego or adrenaline, that's unsustainable. But if it's for mastery, for testing yourself, for representing something bigger, that purpose can sustain you through the hard parts. Take breaks. Your nervous system needs recovery. Your brain needs rest. Don't train year-round at high intensity. Build in off-seasons. Let your body and mind reset. This prevents burnout and maintains long-term performance. Seek therapy, not as a last resort, but as a tool. Mental health support should be part of your training regimen, not something you turn to only when you're broken. Sports psychologists, trauma therapists, meditation teachers, these aren't luxuries. They're necessities for anyone engaged in combat. Practice mindfulness. Learn to be present without narrative. This is the foundation of accessing the void, that state of calm emptiness some fighters describe. Even 5 minutes a day of sitting meditation can create profound changes in how you relate to fear. Respect fear. Don't glorify fearlessness. Fear keeps you safe. It makes you cautious. It forces you to prepare. The goal isn't to eliminate fear. It's to act despite it, to use it as information without being controlled by it. Connect with other warriors, not just fighters, veterans, first responders, anyone who understands what it means to face danger. These connections provide perspective and support. They remind you that you're not alone in this psychological landscape. Plan for life after fighting. Everyone stops eventually. Injury, age, choice. Start building your post-fighting identity now. What will you do when you can't fight anymore? Who will you be? Don't wait until you're forced to answer that question. And finally, know when to stop. This is the hardest one. Many fighters go too long. They take too much damage. They lose too much of themselves. There's no shame in walking away. In fact, walking away before you have to, before you're broken, is one of the bravest things a fighter can do. The mind of a warrior isn't about fearlessness. It's about courage. And courage is feeling fear and choosing to act anyway. It's respecting the danger while not being paralyzed by it. It's training your nervous system to stay functional under pressure while maintaining your humanity. You can be a fierce competitor and still be emotionally available. You can be tough in the cage and gentle outside of it. You can face violence and still value peace. These aren't contradictions. They're balance. And balance is what creates longevity. Not just in fighting, but in life. If this resonated, share it. Let's normalize the psychological complexity of combat. And if you want more explorations of the warrior mind, subscribe.